Hi, this is Ben Carr with another episode of Security Gets Serious. Today we've got a little bit different format. We're coming with Robert Rodriquez, chairman of SINET, investor with SYN. Robert, great to have you on the podcast today, kind of as a guest host, guest question giver. So we'll throw it over to you, maybe a quick little introduction, and then maybe you can introduce panelists today who we have.
Sure. Thank you, Ben. I'm excited to be here and with Jeff and Daniel. I'm the chairman of SINET, founder, and retired Secret Service agent. Been out for 20 years, and I'm also a partner at SYN Ventures. My guest, please introduce yourself.
Sure. Daniel Hooper, CISO for the past 10 years, or Chief Information Security Officer, cybersecurity professional for the past 25 years. Currently an independent advisor and investor in a number of different startups.
Hi, Robert. Jeff Farnich. I'm the head of IT and the CISO at American Funding, a national mortgage firm. I've been there about 5 years, and I've been doing IT about 28 years and cyber around 25 in various capacities.
Well, I know Ben and I are very grateful because you guys are so busy taking time out of your day to join us today. So Joe, let me start with you. How are you currently managing the balance between tactical and strategic responsibilities in your role as a CISO?
I want to expand that because, being the CIO and the CISO, I have to balance both those roles besides the operational, tactical, and strategic. So by far, I spend more of my time on everything security, more on strategy, more on the vendor relationships. That's a key part of my program are the vendors. Without them, can't really do security. But it's really about, where are the risks at? How do I handle the risk? How do I prioritize? And I might establish my program for the year, what the goals are, but that could change on a moment's notice depending on the latest attack tactics and risk. So it's constantly in flux.
So you mentioned the vendors. Do you consider yourself more of a platform person or early adopter, like point solutions, innovation? How do you balance that?
It is both. I have the best of breed, biggest vendors. I also have startups that are in stealth that I'm using in production. Mm-hmm. So it's really a combination of both, and it's been very successful for me. It's worked. By far, the early stage companies innovate the fastest. And of course, the larger companies, more mature, they're the platforms. So I'm trying to establish, what is my strategy as time goes on, because the stack is getting larger. But also the threats are changing so quickly. It's like you can't necessarily rely on a very mature vendor to move as quickly in the market.
Yeah. So, Jeff, there's pros and cons to that, right? Like when I sat in the seat and was doing a lot more operational stuff, you want to lean into the startups because they bring a lot of innovation, but there's potential risk there. And you've got larger companies that are kind of defined players and they built a platform, but there's a risk there too, potentially, right? Lack of innovation, lack of moving forward. So where do you kind of make the break? Where's the decision point on, with this need, I'm going to go more innovative, or with this need, I'm going to stay more large platform play?
Well, I mean, on your core capabilities, let's say EDR, very mature players, identity, very mature players. Let's face it, data security. The key vendors today are not the ones that are very mature. They're behind on DSPM. They're behind on DLP. So really, it's a constant bounce, and I've done it pretty well the last 5 years maintaining that. But I'd say the ecosystem of startups is absolutely key to me to reach my security goals.
I was going to say, I think some of the core parts of the framework are held together by some of those key large vendors that have been around for a long time. I think in the identity space, you've got some of the larger providers that have been around for a long time that do the fundamental pieces, the blocking and tackling pieces really, really well. The MFA vendors, the identity lifecycle vendors, that sort of stuff. They do really, really well. But when it comes to some of the more innovative stuff where we're talking about some of the UEBA type stuff or some of the more specific identity, I want to say sort of threat analytics or something like that around identity. Some of the older, more legacy vendors haven't really sort of followed along with the way trends are moving in that space. Some of the newer, more dynamic vendors are really coming into their own in that space at the moment. So I think the larger platform plays work well for the sort of, I think, foundational, fundamental framework pieces of that. but then leaves lots of little gaps for the very specific, I don't want to say point solutions or point plays, but very specific risk-targeted focused vendors, I think.
So I'm going to follow up on this same topic. So Nikesh doubled down last year, and stock plummeted 33%, something like that. And so I texted 20 CISOs, and I asked them, and I probably should have asked a different question, but I said, would you put all your eggs in one basket? And I should have said, well, would you do it in 2 or 3 large platform plays? But I didn't. And 15 said, essentially, they summed it up, and there were some of the texts were very long, but one said, cybersecurity 101, never put your eggs in one basket. But he's betting on platform, and so is Microsoft, and so is CrowdStrike. As a buyer, how do you feel about that? Platform play, they're going big. What does that do to you?
I mean, we've done it a number of times over the years. I mean, both of us have been in the industry for 25, 30 years kind of thing, and we've seen it happen with Cisco, we've seen it happen with SolarWinds, we've seen it happen with Palo Alto, we've seen these vendors consolidate with a number of different acquisitions, create these platforms. You know, we've used large vendors to manage a lot of different equipment in our environments and been hurt by that in the past. So I think defense in depth has been a tactic for us for a lot of years, where we've tried to separate vendors for different purposes and things, but then we've consolidated under platforms like a Palo Alto or something like that as well. And that can come back to bite us, which we've seen in the past with certain vendors. I think there's room in the market for the large platform play. I think we do continue to see that pendulum swing back to consolidation again, but we do have that in the back of our minds, I think, and Jeff may have a counterpoint to this, but we do have that in the back of our minds of, you know, consolidation comes with that risk of you know, a single vendor creates single vendor risk.
Well, I asked that question because highly respected CEO doubles down, but the buyers are telling me something different. That's why I asked that.
Well, it's a hard thing from a CISO perspective because, you know, you're trying to. I mean, it's a little different IT, and I at some point I want to talk about a little bit about the CIO role because I had that same thing, CIO and CISO, and I think it's an interesting mix. But when you're wearing the CIO hat, it's a lot about cost efficiency and trying to get that you know, the cost and the spend of the organization down to a reasonable level and build on shareholder value. When you have a CISO hat, that's of course part of what you're doing, but the majority of what you're doing is really trying to address that security mindset and how do I defend the organization. And so way back in the day, I worked for Network Associates, right? And they had built this platform play and they would come out with this mission of, you know, net tools and this solution that it's going to solve everything. And it really didn't deliver on that. And I think we've seen that a lot with tools that get acquired, they become part of a platform, but it doesn't really fit into your strategy of the best tool for the solution you have, but the economics start to make sense. And I think Microsoft's done a great job of making the economics make sense. You know, you have an E5 license, it's really hard not to look at those tools, but I think some people have looked at that in the past and said, is this really the right fit? And so there's that constant struggle.
Well, that's historic, right? That's always been the journey, but I think the dynamics of where we're headed with Gen AI, and then I'm hearing the word quantum more than I've ever heard. And I had met quantum companies 10 years ago and 7 and 8, and I just felt bad for them because I knew the market wasn't ready for them.
Way too early.
I don't know where they are today, if they are even exist at all. But I am hearing that word, and then the combination of Gen AI and quantum is going to make this a more innovative, dynamic environment. Jeff, let's go over to you. What challenges do you face in implementing security measures across departments that you do not own?
You know, so a lot of the tool sets that I deploy, for the most part, are enterprise-wide. I'd say the challenges I do have are the ones that are more towards the development side. You know, trying to get more towards not only shift left, but far shift left. My goal for this year is, you know, of course, mature the DevOps practice, but also let's mature the product development practice too. So we try to identify risks early in the innovation stage when the product's being thought about and designed before it rolls in the dev cycle.
But you have CIO and CISO role, and so do you. So it must be easier because you have it all, right? But when I talk to other CISOs, it's either sticks and carrots, and they have board support, and there's accountability to line managers, et cetera. those are the companies that have the most success, but the others that don't have that type of support, it's very challenging. So it's about respecting and collaborating and communicating with the other side, and that takes leadership. But at the end of the day, IT and security to me is more of a change management cultural challenge. What would you recommend to the CISOs who have that one side only?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest challenge is the one side only. It's the running the risk of throwing vulnerabilities over the fence at the engineering teams. So I think that's the hardest thing for security teams. You're finding vulnerabilities using your, whatever, Sneak, SEMGREP, whatever it is, your application security tools in your CI/CD pipelines. You throw it over the fence at the application or the application development teams, the engineering teams, and they say, sorry, we're too busy, go away, kind of thing. It just creates this real cultural divide between the security and the engineering teams, and that creates this huge chasm that you have to then cross. And I think, taking them on that journey, building that rapport with them, being part of their team, whether that's through embedded engineers or, staffing their teams with security professionals, building it into the pipeline, the shift left culture, as Jeff mentioned. There's a lot of different ways you can tackle that. I think building in automation, making it easier for them, I think is goes a long way. So it's not building security in a silo and having those tools built in the security team and then throwing them over the fence, but actually having those security tools operated by the engineering teams, having that ownership shift and having that culture shift, I think, can really help with that. So almost working with the engineering leadership to take security goals and ownership over to the engineering team can really help with that. So then security just becomes part of the engineering culture. Changes that conversation quite fundamentally.
I've seen a lot of people kind of approach it, colleagues, peers, approach it from a technology issue, right? And I'm interested in your thoughts. Like, I don't see it really as much a technology issue as it's a culture issue. And so when you go into a new role as a CISO, really the first thing you should do is spend a lot of time figuring out how to either work within the culture or make the changes to culture to be most effective. Do you guys see the same thing?
It is, yeah, and exactly where I was going with that. That's the hardest part is changing that culture. It's a slow-moving wheel, and I don't think you can put in a new tool that's going to change the culture. Right? It becomes a much harder conversation.
Yeah, it really gets to that, actionability through influence. And going back to the development process, as you educate the development team, they want to address the risks. They understand it, and I bring a lot of time regulations to it. I mean, gosh, being a financial, I have to deal with various regulations nationwide, state and federal. The problem is a lot of times product release cycles to bring enhanced products for the business or customers conflicts with trying to address security. So it's like, how do you make sure security is not second fiddle to enhancements? So that's one of the struggles I'm trying to work
You
on.
mentioned OKRs, and I love the concept of like getting it really at the top culturally into the OKR, so everybody realizes like it's not all about availability or release. It's about availability and release in a safe, managed way, right?
You're both seasoned risk executives, and I do call CISOs risk executives because I feel that you manage more risk than most people at any corporation with increasing liability. What keeps you up at night? You've got geopolitical things that you need to be apprised of with China, the Middle East, Russia, North Korea. There's the SEC and the regulators. I do believe that with Gensler being out, I have talked to some former SEC folks, that the pressure will subside somewhat, but it's still there, given what happened to Joe Sullivan, Tim Brown, and Richard Barretto. In fact, in Tim Brown's case, last July, the judge threw out 90% of the case. And I found out later, which I believe to be true, is that the SEC tried to leverage their banking finance acumen and processes and tweak it to cyber, but it didn't work. And then the month later, they threw out the case on progress, or they stopped the case, the investigation on progress.
So to add in there, Robert, do you think shareholder lawsuits and that's going to increase like we've seen from the regulatory side, but do you think the potential for litigation on the shareholder side is going to add an additional twist in there too?
I think that's always a pressure there.
Yeah.
But there's so many things in wellness, right? We don't talk about wellness enough. And you mentioned identity earlier. So identity is the word that, so when I talk to the CISOs, and I talk to sometimes 10, 20 a week, that's the one that really percolated the fastest over the last 12 months or so to the top of the totem pole. Well, data's at the top. It's always at the top. And then supply chain and third party was also there. What keeps you up at night? There's a lot going on.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think it's the unknown. So it's, what are we walking into any given day, right? Whether it's a business change that you didn't know about, a regulatory change that's coming, a particular threat that you hadn't foreseen, a business executive that's decided to launch some sort of product that you didn't know about and that changes a way that you interact with customers in a certain way, or introduces a data set that you hadn't thought of before, which brings a whole new level of risk. So I think it's that, how do you stay close enough to the business that you can foresee any potential risks and challenges that are coming while you're still doing all of the blocking and tackling and the day-to-day operational stuff that you have to do to keep the company and the customers and the system safe. So I think it's that, balancing that, the sort of the tactical day-to-day operational stuff while keeping that strategic participation with the business side of things. That balance I've always found to be the hardest challenge, I think. When it comes to the totem pole of things, I think you're right on. I think it's the data protection piece is very paramount. Obviously, GDPR, CCPA, DORA is changing the way we think about things now as well. I think identity is a huge issue. Zero trust was a big conversation a lot of years ago when we think about network. That has expanded now to identity being the edge. As we've gone, SaaS broke the network model. Mm-hmm. Identity is now breaking the SaaS model quite a lot. So I think identity, data, those would be the two big things. We still talk about vulnerability management like we did 25 years ago. I'm really sick of talking about vulnerability management, but we still talk about that and patching. And so I think those three things on the top of the list, I think are the.
Did you want to
top
say
three things.
Hygiene?
Yeah, God. Everyone take a shower. That'd be good. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Jeff.
It's a lot of things. Going back to, you mentioned SEC. Luckily, my organization, my employer, is not public. We're private. But still, I have to do with all 50 states. Mm-hmm. And New York is a very strict regulation, NYDFS. I mean, that's got a lot of teeth to it. And just this past couple of weeks, a mortgage company was basically fined by 53 state agencies. That means potentially 3 states or had more than one agency involved in this joint effort to find a company $20 million.
150 now? 3 times 50?
I don't know. You get FTC. So I have to deal with all 50 states. I have to deal with FTC. I have to deal with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, who are the GSCs who buy the mortgages and repackage them, sell on the market. I have to deal with clients who are subservicing. I mean, it's like 80 plus entities I got to test my controls to on a somewhat regular basis. And it's frustrating that there's really
and the lack of commonality in those. I mean, and then especially like you're dealing with the U.S., but like if you move internationally, like that just magnifies even worse.
Yeah, there's no standard framework. You have to use multiple frameworks. So that's kind of one thing is the regulatory controls are always moving. They're getting more strict. But also when you look at all the attacks or breaches the last few years, majority of those were not based on AI, and they still got through at a very rapid pace. When AI is totally weaponized, my fear is that most organizations won't stand a chance. So my fear is, and I'm seeing this now, is the attacks that we're seeing are being marked as low by multiple vendors when in fact it's like, no, this is a medium or high. So we may miss it at first because the tools are not catching up with the change in attack methods. So that's
we had a conversation last night at dinner about this, and I think the word that we came up was velocity, right? Like the increase in velocity of the attacks is going to be something that I think if you're not thinking about, you really need to start focusing on, right? Because AI just makes that velocity so much more important as a metric.
Yeah, the velocity, but also the specificity of the attacks as well.
Yeah,
so
the ability to tune, right?
Yeah, rather than hey, you've got a FedEx package delivery that goes to 50 of your employees, it's now, Daniel, you've got this thing that Jeff has sent to you because they know that Jeff and I talk about this specific thing that they've seen on social media that Jeff and I interact about or something like that. So they're really specifically targeting and generating very specific messages and things. So it's much more believable.
I'd also add, I'm very concerned with the supply chain. I mean, at this point, you really can't trust any vendor, and third-party risk management's broken. So you do evaluation, they look they look strong and good, and next day they're compromised. They deploy poor code to you. It's like nonstop. So how do we get a better handle on third-party risk? Because we rely on these critical vendors to secure our systems, and now they're being compromised at an increasing rate.
Identity, third-party risk, data. But the word going back earlier, well, I love this word velocity. I think it takes over from, I always say dynamic environment, but velocity I think is the word of the day. But increased visibility is something that during the DT era and to today, I just want greater visibility. But then you have to be careful what you wish for. Now you have data overload and you need contextualization so that you can prioritize on what's important to address, to achieve operational resilience, remediate and achieve supreme operational resilience. How do you feel about identity going forward with the Gen AI and maybe even quantum? I don't know how that plays into that. Does that scare you?
It does. I think the context is really important. I think we don't talk enough about context. I think we talk a lot about visibility, but we don't quite yet talk enough about context. We talk a lot about coverage. We talk a lot about the visibility, and I think when we talk about coverage of tools and we talk about how many endpoints do you have, how many assets, we talk about asset management. It's usually at the top of the list.
We talk about the
NIST
lack of
like
asset
that.
management.
We talk about the lack of asset management and things. We talk about coverage, right?
Yeah.
So you say, okay, you talk about EDR tools, right? What's your percentage? You take an OKR or a metric or something. You say, what's your coverage of EDR tools in your environment, right? 98% is good enough, right? That's usually where you track. Okay, that's cool. That's awesome. But what's the context of that? Is that endpoints? Is that servers? Is that endpoints in the field? Is that endpoints that are sitting in an office environment? What's the context around that? Is that higher risk endpoints? Is that lower risk endpoints? Is that fully patched endpoints? Is that not patched endpoints? Like what are we talking about here? So that's a great metric, and I think that's a great fundamental metric to say you have to have coverage of your security tools. That's awesome. You have to know what assets are on your network, and you have to have coverage. But what's that additional context? Do you understand where your sensitive data is? Okay, we have customer PII. Okay, well, but what's the context around that? Who uses it? Who's got access to it? Why do they use it? Why do they need access to it? When should they be using it? What business processes interact with that? What's the context around that PII? It's great that you know where it is and you know that it's in a secured enclave and that it's backed up and it's encrypted and stuff like that. But why do you even have it?
Yeah.
Why do you even need it?
When was the last time it was accessed or used? Like how old is the data?
Yeah, how old is it? Can you archive it? Can you get rid of it? Do you really need to keep it or not?
So this conversation is interesting to me, and I'm reflecting on, let's say, 7-10 years ago. It was a very different conversation, right, Ben?
Yeah. 100%. Yeah. I mean, it's certainly
evolved a lot.
changed. Yeah. Look, and I think some of the stuff we talk about is the exact same thing. Like we're still talking about asset management, vulnerability management, right? Like that's kind of ridiculous that hasn't been solved. But now, again, I think it goes back to velocity and AI and the potential access to this. It's, what used to may have been good coverage if you had good context on it, right, which was unlikely. That percentage of gap may not be sufficient anymore because of the velocity of the attacks coming in, the potential targeting that can be done. Yet I think the landscape has definitely shifted and changed, and we talked about non-human identity, right? Like I think that's something that you've been doing it for a while, but a lot of people are still trying to get their hands around non-human identity and what that means. And I think that's because the landscape has shifted and changed, and I don't think we're keeping up, right? It's moving a lot faster, right? It's kind of almost a Moore's law. Like we're not keeping up with the velocity of change.
I want to get back to wellness, and I want you in this involved.
I love that discussion. Yeah.
And we were just talking about the ski trip that you're going on to Jackson Hole, where Heather and I live. And in fact, it's the same weekend almost that I'm hosting a CISO ski outing. So hopefully you can join us.
Love to.
But so Ben, how many years have you been in this business?
Geez, more than I like to count, Robert, since about 95. But I mean, core security, probably about, 2003, 2004.
So I don't think 10 years ago or even 7-8 years ago, people were talking about wellness in the profession, right?
I actually don't think people were really having that discussion until kind of COVID. Like I think that started off that discussion for a lot of people, but I think security in general, because when people moved out of the office, it was kind of a little bit of respite for some people, but I think security people got tuned up to 11, right? Like we had to think about, okay, now everybody's out of the office. We're doing with remote stuff. We didn't have a plan for this before. The VPN isn't sufficient for that. We've got to move to something else. And so that workload increased exponentially. And then we were having this, well, you're working from home, so you can work anytime, right? It wasn't, shut off at 5 and go home. And I think a lot of people were dealing with burnout, and that conversation actually raised. And security's always been a stressful area because it's fine until it isn't, and then we all deal with stress. And it seems like I think the joke in the security industry is that vulnerability, that compromise always happens on the weekend or on vacation, right? It never happens on 4 o'clock on a Wednesday. Yeah. I think that's a real thing. I'm glad you brought it up. I think we need to talk about it more openly. I think we need to talk about how we help our teams. And then I think as CISOs, as senior level executives within the organization, we need to model the behavior that we want to instill in our teams. And I think we don't do a good job of that. Like we're working all the time. We're perceived as always on. We're always hard charging 100%. But you got to take time off. You got to have a deputy, a second, somebody you can turn the reins over to and say, hey, you've got this for a week while I go out and do stuff. I think that mental health, that self-help of managing your own health, I think is really important in how we address the teams. I see head nodding. You guys agree with that, obviously?
Yeah, I think this applies even more to the IT teams because they're doing the patch at night, they're doing deployments, they're working the weekends, they're doing with the outages. Surely security teams have a lot to do, but I don't see them working, at least on my side, my organization, as much at night as my IT team is. Mm-hmm. But either way, I mean, face it, I try to make my environment enjoyable, minimize any tension and conflict between team members. We don't need politics in the office where people are not getting along. Like, we got our enemies, the threat actors, not each other or team friction, okay? Yeah. So that really helps a lot, and I keep it fun, and the team loves the innovation. I think when your organization gets static where you can't address problems, they just fester. I think that's very frustrating. But when you're trying to move fast, fail fast to solve problems, people just love that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the innovation piece is really key. I think the workload piece is always hard to balance. I think we're always asked to do more with less.
Yeah, less budget.
We're definitely off the back of the hype curve. I think personal opinion as far as budgets don't increase like they used to. I think corporate budgets in general don't increase like they used to, unfortunately. But something that I've been called out on as a leader before as well, sending Slack messages at 11 o'clock at night to people, and people feel like they're expected to reply because the boss sent them a message at 11 o'clock at night. They feel like they're obligated to reply, and so there's a feature in Slack to schedule your messages when they go out and stuff. So I was encouraged to use that feature by someone.
But do you feel that the younger generation, they take weekends off, kind of a mentality? Is it different than when you worked as a young?
I think some do, some don't. I definitely think there is more of that culture of people do feel like they have the freedom to disconnect. I think people do definitely feel like they are allowed to disconnect. Like their work is work, life is life, and they feel like they're allowed to tune more into their work-life balance than perhaps an older generation was. I think people definitely, when I was coming up through the tech industry and things like that, I was online 24/7 kind of thing.
Weekends, right?
I traveled with my laptop. I traveled with 2 phones. I went everywhere with a laptop. I was.
Well, I think culturally, like if you look at generationally where we are, so we're kind. I saw this interesting meme talking about how like we're in a unique generation. I'm assuming we're all kind of in that generation, right? We all remember analog phones with the rotary dials, right? Yep. We all remember going to the mall. What's a mall, right? We all remember going to the mall and like there wasn't a phone on your hip. Like you had to meet somebody at a certain time. Younger generation, they've had connection to cell phones the whole time. Like when I first started, cell phones weren't a thing. pagers were kind of the thing. And then we had 2 8-pagers, and everybody was excited because you could text like all the time, right? And then you had a phone, and it was like, you wore it proudly on your hip as a badge of honor that you had this connectivity. And I think that was this always connected, always on mentality. And I think there's been a pushback against that. It's like, I don't want to be connected all the time now. I think that's somewhat good.
It was a sort of a sense of pride that you were important enough
Yes,
to be on
yeah.
call.
Yeah.
You were needed because you
great
were on
point.
call, right? You were the hero for being online at 11 o'clock at night kind of thing.
Yeah.
Whereas now,
Well, the
I
equivalent's
think it's
the
opposite.
doctor who had the pager that had to,
that's
I got to
right,
get to
yeah.
surgery. Well,
Yeah,
I'm the
exactly.
IT guy. Like,
Yeah.
I've got servers down, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, there's an incident at 1 o'clock in the morning. I'm online. I'm ready to go. Don't worry about this. I got this. It's okay. Yeah.
I want to get into ransomware. Before I do, I want to ask you about how do you ensure your security investments are understood and valued by your board of directors?
That's a really good question. I always love the board of directors conversations. They're some of my favorites. I think sitting in a room with folks that just love to ask questions, and the questions are always things like, "Are we good? Are we spending enough, or are we spending too much?" kind of thing. And how do we compare to our peers and things like that. And when it comes to that question about investments, it's always such a hard conversation to answer. And they very rarely get down into the nitty gritties of are we is Okta the right tool, or whatever kind of thing. But they'll ask the questions like are we worried about ransomware? Are we worried about malware? Are we worried about phishing or something like that? And so you can
Yeah, it's something they read in the news, right?
something
Like,
they read in the news or something that
I saw
they-
Change Healthcare this week. Like, does that
Yeah,
impact us?
Something they heard at a conference, or something their lawyer told them about, or something like that. And so you can get into the vendor conversation a little bit, or we can say, oh yes, our primary spend is on identity management. And they can say, okay, well, why? And we can say, because it's the most complicated thing. We've got 10,000 staff, and they're constantly moving around, and we've got 10,000 staff using 400 applications, and each application has an average of 30 roles within it. So just the level of complexity requires a level of spend. So we can sort of ballpark it with them around those kinds of conversations. When it gets into the hot topics and stuff, and about ransomware in particular, you can say, well, yes, we're investing in best of breed technologies. And then we can talk about specific controls in that space. So I think, the board level conversations, I'd usually avoid talking about specific tools and technologies, but I would talk about a level of investment at the board level.
Yeah, alignment to business. You're meeting the level of risk tolerance that they expect, right?
Yeah.
Well, specific to ransomware, what type of models, tools, approaches do you leverage to mitigate your risk?
Yeah, so I think the conversation has shifted over the last few years from prevention to recovery, I think. So it was always the sort of blocking at the front door, how can we prevent that initial attack vector, from phishing emails or malware or viruses, things like that coming in, to more, okay, we can do that blocking and tackling up front, but now we need to make sure that the enterprise is as resilient as possible, kind of thing. How quickly can we recover from this thing? Can we recover the endpoint? Can we recover the server? Can we recover the data? And what are the layers of that? And so, I don't know, Jeff, you probably have a sort of different opinion to that, but I think it's a two-pronged attack now.
Yeah, so multiple things here. One is the way I update, and so I update leadership. The top C-levels, like 6 of us are part of the cyber committee that I meet upwards of almost monthly. And besides going through all the current news that's coming out, like which of our peers have been breached, who hasn't breached, change in regulations, the latest fines kind of set the tone, where it's at. I always share a summary of my budget of projects for the year that's currently mapped out and renewals. Then I have a breakdown on PowerPoint of where things stand. Then I get into the current projects that are near term. That's what I've done in the past, and that's worked fairly well. But what happens though is each year your current year's project's new spend becomes the next year's renewal. So you're constantly increasing your amount of spend. So I am working now to get more detailed and transparent. I have I'll call it like a summary 1-page PowerPoint that talks about the problem statement. What's the solution? Why are we doing this? If there's any kind of ROI I got tied to it, that kind of is where I'm going now. With some few additional slides. When you get too detailed with the vendors, the partners, or what the discount level is at, it changes the conversation. Pretty soon you get off track and you have no time to talk about what really matters. So that's kind of been my approach now. But I've been lucky the last 5 years. I've got a lot done. I took a program from having nothing in security to where it's at today, which is, it's a very strong program.
And your corporation is one of the largest in the country. It's 70% market share in your industry.
Oh no. I mean, for mortgage, there's lots of mortgage companies. There's banks. There's non-banks. We're now going to
for lending.
Well, yeah, like I said, there's definitely ones that are non-banks, IMBs that are larger than us. Okay. We're in the top 10, definitely. And
Do you
growing.
feel there's any misconceptions when it comes to ransomware?
Well, I mean, I think the challenge is it's always in the news. So it's like it's always out there. We hear about it. I do report payments. Of course, a lot of payments are never reported.
Yeah.
So there is awareness about it. There's also awareness about all the other attacks. And the challenge I have is we're seeing more activity on the identity front than on the ransomware. So that's where more of the focus is at. It's surely definitely a concern. And, ransomware is the ultimate end game for the threat actor to get in, take your data, potentially lock you out and lock you down. So it's definitely a concern. But the concerns now are a lot more than just ransomware. It's identity. It's all around the data. I mean, we're a foundation company. We have to know where all the data is at and controls because, that's what's going to be ransom eventually.
Well, I think data is interesting because, and you mentioned it right on the resilience side. So I think the discussion about ransomware used to be about the encryption factor, right? It used to really be about, okay, we're getting encrypted, we're prevented from accessing these systems, and there's some downtime as an association with it. But the change in the economy has really been this RAS economy, the ransomware as a service. And that's kind of manifested in these actors figuring out, okay, I can make $1 here, but what if I can make 10, right? What if I can make 100? What if I can make 1,000? So it's about, again, I go back to this word, and maybe that's going to be the word of the year for me is velocity, right? It's the velocity of impact to organizations. And I think these organizations that are on the ransomware economy side and the threat actor side are saying, okay, like I don't really even have to encrypt now, right? What I have to do is have to get access to the data, exfiltrate the data, and then I can extort the company for that data. I can extort their customers and their vendors for that data. I can extort, the third, fourth, fifth parties down the line. And so it becomes this large problem where the outage or the issue that you had isn't, or even the payment of the ransomware isn't the big impact. It's all the associated stuff. So change, what was it, a 25, 22, I can't remember exactly, but it was a relatively small, $20+ million ransom, but the overall impact over $2 billion, right, in outage and time to them. So I think that's where we're seeing, at least in my perspective and what I hear from our customers and people we're talking to, is that the concern is about what's the larger impact and the resilient side. How do I get up quickly, right? Maybe I can go to backup and I can get up, but if it takes me 4 months, like there's still a large impact to business on that. So how can I, one, hopefully still do prevention, but if that doesn't work, because it always won't, how do I get the recovery quickly and prevent that exfiltration where I don't have an impact?
Last year I introduced the concept of cyber resilience because in the past it's always about posture.
Yeah.
What's your posture? Is it controls? We're doing well. Compared to our competitors, we're, posture looks great. And pretty soon it's like, oh, well, we don't have to be great. We have to be just in the middle. It's like, well, that's not where I want to go. But now they realize having peers, 4 major peers breached last year was actually a blessing because it was a wake-up call that, hey, this happens to companies that are larger than us, and they saw the impact that it caused them.
Do you do anything with metrics on that? Like a resilience metric? Do you measure that at all in any way?
Well, I mean, there is. Sometimes I try to map it with fair ma'am. I mean, there's some good information out there about what this breach cost.
Yeah.
Safe Security does. So that helps with Change Healthcare and a few others. And you can see the medium, estimated, and the high. But just seeing alone the fines. Just a couple weeks ago, like I mentioned, one mortgage company had 5.5 million records, and they were fined $20 million.
Yeah.
Most organizations have more than 5.5 million records, so it becomes a big number quickly.
Yeah, it really does. I was just wondering on the resilience side. I mean, I hadn't really thought about it before, but it's interesting to think if there was some way to measure, like, here's our investment, right? In a ransomware incident, we're on a 10-day resilience factor, right? Well, I'm not comfortable with that. I'd like it at 5, right? Like to measure sometime, like if we had this type of outage, it's this resilience factor. If there was some way to figure that out in a business risk tolerance format, like, because I think that's what the business is often looking for is, I understand from a finance, from marketing, from a real estate, like I understand what my tolerance is for risk, but I think I often find that, sitting with the rest of the C-level executives in the boardroom, it's really hard for them to understand what the risk potential is that we're dealing with, right? We kind of intrinsically know it, but the communication is super hard.
Yeah, and I think a lot of company executives that I've worked with anyway, they understand, if the business is down, like if their website's down, if it's an e-commerce business or if it's a trading company, a manufacturing firm or something like that, if the operations are down, they understand generally that there's an impact and there's trickle-down effect. There's an economic impact to that, right? There's a trust and reputation impact to that. There's an economic impact to that. And so, if it's an investment management company, then you end up disconnected from the market. There's opportunity costs. There's potential trading risk cost. You can't exit certain positions, et cetera, et cetera, right? If you're a manufacturing firm, obviously there's potential marketing cost, or if you've got a bunch of stuff that's sitting on a shelf not being sold, it spoils, product loss, right? It's fairly easy to do that math, and I think a lot of CFOs and boards and things probably understand that fairly well already. So it's a pretty easy map for us to say, okay, if we have a significant IT outage, like a ransomware outage, and we say, okay, hard stop for 5 days while we're dealing with a ransomware and we're rebuilding the network. You look at what happened to Maersk years ago, kind of thing, where global shipping for Maersk stopped for 10 days or whatever it was, right? That's a massive impact globally to the supply chain, kind of thing. So pretty easy to measure that. And,
but harder to measure like what the investment in your program is relative to the potential for the time of outage, right? Like
exactly. And so it's pretty easy to say, okay, well, this is what the catastrophic impact is going to be to the business. And so let's walk that back and look at, okay, what are the potential investments we can make? And then now it starts to make a bit more sense. You don't need to go down the whole factor analysis and risk path and do the sort of calculations, although that is a great framework to do that. And there's a couple of products out there that help you map through that, like an Ostrich or something like that helps you map through some of that. But I think boards and senior executives understand those concepts already, that if we have a hard stop, there's going to be an impact. So it's fairly easy for us as cybersecurity professionals to say black swan event could be a ransomware event or a massive system outage or a DDoS attack or something like that, right? So we could fairly quickly say, okay, the likelihood of us having a massive event like a ransomware event or something and doing a full system shutdown is probably pretty low, but the time required to recover from it could be 2 weeks. So okay, what does that look like from a business perspective, kind of thing?
Let's stay on metrics and measurement, but let's apply it to your people. Do you have any models, approaches on how you measure both the technical and strategic approach that they're using as your colleagues? Like, how do you measure them and their efficiency, effectiveness? Other than, I guess, an evaluation that you might do once a year?
I kind of rely on the managers to identify, who's the top performer, which is always obvious, who's middle and who's, towards the bottom that need to be probably coached up, or if that's not going to work, coached out.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, luckily the organization isn't having an abrasive approach where every year 5% are cut, per se, as much. That seems to be becoming more common now. I mean, GE set the standard, Jack Welch did years ago. Yeah. But I think now just Facebook just did it like this.
Manage out
past week.
Taking the Zuckerberg approach here.
But I think it's really good because you have to understand, how does you want to keep your high performers happy because you cannot afford to leave. The ones that are mid performers, let's work them up to high performers. The ones that are lower, it's like, it's all about productivity. I mean, we got to make sure that they perform better. So it's about education, training. So
when you look at people and you look at hires, right, and maintaining staff and people, I've seen some interesting articles recently of people advising and saying, you should hire quickly and fire quickly, right? Take the risk on somebody, right? I know a lot of companies typically spend a lot of time in the hiring process. Some of them, it's kind of ridiculous and they lose candidates because of it. But I've seen this contrary advice recently of take the risk, hire somebody. If they don't work out, just get rid of them quickly. How do you feel about that in the cyber side?
Well, I think you have to, because if you find a strong candidate, if you wait on the hiring process, someone else is going to snag them on you. And
there's no perfect candidate either, right?
There isn't. But on the ones that are not performing, I think it's very critical they're identified quickly who they are. And you need to plan. So I'm holding my manager accountable. Listen, you need to know. That's why I ask them, I want a ranking, 1, 2, 3. Yeah. The ones that are 3s, what's your plan? because I'm going to hold you accountable for not taking action sooner, because otherwise it's going to fester on and on.
I think the important thing that too is if you're ranking, like, what's your plan for your number ones? How are you keeping them? What you're retaining, right?
Better
Because
pay them at market or above market.
yeah. Training, like, how are you engaging with them? What tasks are you giving them to enhance and show their leadership and promotion within the org? I mean, like, it's just important to maintain on the ones as it is on the threes, right?
What I started doing about 6 months ago is every month we have a team department presentation, 100+ people. We list every department, every person's certifications.
Oh, I like
On
that. Yeah.
yours, okay, some just like 20 certifications, like triple CCIEs and elsewhere. Other ones like none. It's like, okay, this kind of to show you, this is me telling you, you need to start doing this.
If you know that you have to fire someone eventually, it doesn't get easier.
Yeah.
You need to fire fast.
And it can be
It just
painful
gets
for your
worse.
team.
Yeah, it's hard. It's a hard thing. So let's talk about your top needs and requirements. Got a very dynamic space with increasing velocity. I love that word. What are they?
Top needs?
There's a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot. That's the problem. I'm going to cycle back to the context piece, I think. It's really easy to say visibility because that's the default setting, I think, for a lot of people. But I think we're getting better at the visibility piece. I think the context piece is the hardest piece for us
Right.
to solve. I think that's probably the short answer, I think.
I mean, for me, it's, how can I keep innovating the pace I have in the past? Because it adds stress to the team to constantly work with vendors to roll out solutions. I am looking harder now at which vendors are not performing. And I'm about to create a vendor scorecard that I give out quarterly
Yeah.
with various measures from the level of CEO or founder engagement, the velocity of innovation. Are they actually reducing risk? Because if vendors, much like employees, they're not performing, then you know what? Sorry, we're not going to renew you.
Well, sometimes they have the 6-month mentality, the honeymoon, right? The honeymoon period.
Do
then
you
they
do
fall off.
reviews, like quarterly or annual reviews with your vendors?
We don't. There was a couple that I fired recently, and they were kind of caught off guard. It's like, well, maybe I should have been more truthful. So, but they knew they weren't engaged, right?
Yeah.
If I haven't heard from the founder in 3 years in a one-on-one, just quick meeting, it's like
Because you always hear from vendors when they come in, hey, we're going to be a partner on this, right? We're going to partner.
Or
I
you
don't-
hear when they're
I
going to
don't
renew. It's like, I
think
haven't heard
what
from 9
they-
months.
Yeah, well, that's when they come back and they tell you how good of a partner where they were, but you haven't heard from them in the in-between. And I think
You don't do an annual.
we need to talk about that and be better at that on the CISO side of actually managing vendors, engaging with them, forcing them to deliver on the commitments they had and building those real relationships. Because those are the vendors that I always, if we had a relationship and we were engaged, I always felt I got much better support and delivery out of the vendor.
You don't
So
have
Ben, you have a lot of entrepreneurs on the audience.
Yeah.
So I want to ask the question, how do entrepreneurs get to you guys? 'Cause it's so hard, right?
LinkedIn,
and
just
you've
send us
got
messages.
these,
Cold calling, right? Cold calling works.
They link in with your wife. They send a drone with a package through your window. It's unbelievable, the creativity, right? How do
Well, I'd
you do
say
it?
take me skiing, but no, I'm not gonna say that. It's hard because a lot of people I turn down because for me, I don't have limited time. I got a day job, I got a personal life with a family, so I got to pick and choose. It's really about give me an elevator pitch, ideally over an email or LinkedIn, what you're doing, what's different. If you're another Me Too vendor, it's like I got vendors already.
Yeah.
So it's got to be a standout. Like, why do I need to talk to you?
Yeah, I think something really interesting that I read fairly recently. It's a give ask kind of thing. Like, give me something I can use, give me something else I can use, and then ask me for something after that. So help me out. Give me an interesting piece of information that you've seen recently. Give me an introduction to someone else that you think might be an interesting person for me, kind of thing, and then ask me for something else after that. So. Can you help my team? Is there something that is going on in my organization? Is there something interesting happening in the industry that you might think that I might want to know about? Can you help be part of the community?
Yeah.
Which a lot of vendors are already doing. Everyone's part of the community and everyone's trying to solve the greater good and all that sort of stuff. And it's a very good community.
What I hear
already.
you saying is
But-
wanting to make a connection, build a relationship, and earn trust with
Exactly,
you.
yeah.
And
Don't
really
just
be a
send me a
good
white paper.
partner. Be part of
Yeah.
the community in an earnest,
Yeah.
what I call walking with purpose.
Yeah. Hey, Daniel, can I grab 15 minutes to show you the latest piece of X? No, like I can look at your website and I can watch the video kind of thing. And if I'm interested, I'll call you kind of thing. But, if it's, hey, Daniel, did you see this cool article kind of thing? And it's like, oh, okay, no, I didn't. Thank you. That's really interesting. Okay, now we've got a relationship kind of thing.
Yeah, also say, I'm not going to talk to a salesperson. If it's a founder or a CEO or a very top-level person, I'll make time for that. The salesperson, I'm sorry, you're not close enough to understanding what the mission is, your vision, which to me is critical because a lot of times I'll buy on how do I connect with that founder, that executive.
Relationship.
Yeah,
Right.
it is.
So as we get ready to wrap up, I want to ask all three of you, if you would put on your entrepreneurial hat or your investor hat or both, what's out there or not out there today that you would invest in or build if you were an entrepreneur or an investor? Ben, I think I know what your answer is.
Yeah, well, look, you said that's not out there, but my ransomware, right? I mean, I think that's obviously with Halcyon, like we see a big problem in that space. I think I'm looking for something that actually brings value to the AI security discussion, right? I mean, I haven't found that yet. I think that there's a lot of talk about it, but again, the velocity is what concerns me. So I want to see how do we get in front as an industry in front of the velocity that's bringing, and then that tracks back to my ransomware answer, right? Is like I just see this being a much, much bigger problem than people are realizing. I don't think it's hit yet, but I think it's kind of this wave, a tsunami, right? You can see the water pull out, but you're like, what's going on? And I see the water coming back in. It just hasn't hit yet, and I'm waiting till that hits. So that's my answer.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think AI and identity is a space that I'm digging into quite a bit at the moment. Agentic AI and how that relates to identity specifically. So you talk about non-human identity, service accounts, things like that is something that we've been dealing with for a very long time. How does that relate to AI agents specifically when you're talking about agents that work together as a team that need to be able to do RAG calls to pull data from various data sources, online SaaS tools, internal databases, that sort of stuff. They require some sort of identity framework of some description to be able to access that kind of data. So the way that we think about non-human identity today doesn't work in that model.
Yeah.
And so there's a couple of founders that I'm talking to at the moment that have got some really interesting ways they're thinking about this problem space at the moment. So as someone that's looking for investment and advising opportunities and potentially solution building in the future around this space, that's an interesting area for me right now, is how we think about identity around agentic frameworks around AI, I think.
I like it.
I was going to say identity too. It's about really identity fabric, bringing all my identity signals from human, non-human, customer, workforce. But since you kind of touched on it a little bit, I'm going to say really a data fabric where I have complete visibility of all my data, structured, unstructured, on-premise, cloud, at rest, in motion. So I know at any point in time what's happening in the data. So it's really the visibility of the data lineage, any point in time.
Wow. So let's go raise some capital and build a company, gentlemen. Well, I want to thank all of you. It's been an honor to be here, Ben. Thank you so much. And I look forward to doing this again.
Yeah, thank you guys. And Robert, thank you for jumping in and helping host this session. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.